Hi, here to talk about outcome or impact evaluation in our third video. Before we get into it, I just want to bring back our CDC evaluation cycle. By now, you have enough information to really be at the focus the evaluation stage, the green circle in this cycle. You have information on process evaluation, you're going to get information on outcome evaluation, but whatever you decide to do, what you want to do is you want to make sure that you bring these things to the table to help you make a decision. By now you know to think about program stage. You also want to think about what resources are available. Do you have enough funds? Do you have enough time and capacity to do what you want to do? What does your theory of change say about what might be most useful about evaluation? And then also, what are the stakeholder priorities? You can even think about doing a quick and short evaluability assessment to help you make that decision. Speaking of stage, when we're thinking about outcome evaluation, we absolutely want to make sure that our program is in steady state, whether it's in program maintenance. That's very important because remember in the process evaluation video, we talked about type 3 error, one of those errors being that different groups in the program are actually receiving different versions of the program. Well, that's actually what happens in mid-course correction stage. So if it's not in steady state yet, then don't think about beginning your outcome evaluation. How do we know what program stage our program is in? Well, one quick way to find out is to ask the program planners and designers, what stage are you in? And if the answer doesn't actually give you a clear indication, you might want to ask these additional questions. How long has the program been up and running? Remember, stage is not equivalent to a certain amount of time since the beginning of the program, but if the answer is something like 2 months, it's not likely that the program is in program maintenance yet. Also, you might want to ask, has the program been undergoing some sizable changes in the recent past? And also, for how long has the program been maintained in its current state? You might even want to ask, are you planning on making some sizable changes in the future? And all this information will help you determine whether or not the program is in fact in program maintenance stage or not. So we know that evaluation is about capturing the change that a program brings about and identifying the causes of that change. And just because you're not doing a randomized clinical trial doesn't mean that you can't make inferences about causality and whether the program is causing some of the changes. You might want to consider some of these other factors. Is the program preceding the observed outcomes? How about that program theory? Does it actually predict the outcomes that we're looking at in our evaluation? Does the presence or the absence of the program correlate with the outcomes that we're measuring in our evaluation? And also, there should be few to no plausible rival explanatory factors that could account for the correlation between the program and the outcomes that we're looking at in our evaluation. And we use evaluation designs to help us meet these criteria for demonstrating causality. And if we don't use a randomized clinical trial as our design, which is most often the case, we're in good company because over 75% of published evaluations are either quasi-experimental or non-experimental designs. Let's look at that a little bit closer. So we've got two types of designs that I've mentioned so far. The experimental or the randomized design, where individuals who are willing to be part of a treatment are either randomized to receiving a treatment or some kind of a control condition. Or we have our quasi-experimental design, where individuals choose whether or not they get the treatment. And so you have a treatment group, and they're there by choice, and then you have to go around looking for a comparison group, which is really our challenge. Sometimes it's the people who said no, but there's something very special about the people who said no that often makes them not the ideal comparison group. So there's other strategies that you can use to come up with different comparison groups, sometimes more than one. But let's look a little deeper in that quasi-experimental and non-experimental column. So there's many different types of actually quasi-experimental and non-experimental designs. I've listed 6 here for you. Let me tell you, there's dozens more, but I just want to give you a sense of the variety of different kinds of designs. And a quick reminder, in the very right column, when you see an O, that stands for an observation, a data collection point. And when you see an X, that is an intervention. So for that top row, the before and after design, it is a single group design where the intervention group has an observation, then they get an intervention, and then after the intervention, they have another observation. For the static group comparison design, it's actually a design that has a comparison group, as the name implies, and there's an intervention given to the treatment group, and then an observation after the intervention, both for the treatment and the comparison group. So you get the idea of how to read the symbols on the right, and you can look at the different types of designs and the names of the designs. Some of these do and some of these don't have comparisons. One of the strongest designs is at the very bottom. It's the comparative time series design, and I'm hoping you can see it because I see my face covering it. If you can't see it, it is it has a comparison group, and there's actually multiple observations before the intervention, and then multiple observations after the intervention. So it looks just like that single time series design, but with a comparison group. The reason it's strong is because you're able to capture multiple observations before and after the intervention, so you can be certain about whether or not, more certain, whether or not the presence or absence of the intervention correlates with the level of outcome that you are able to demonstrate with your evaluation data. So why do we care about so many different types of designs? One reason, and a major reason, is because one of the biggest challenges in evaluation design, outcome evaluation design, are minimizing threats to the validity of the findings. So what do I mean by that? Let's talk about one type of validity that epidemiologists are very familiar with. That's external validity or generalizability. That is, how generalizable are the findings to the larger target population that we'd like to be serving with our evaluation? Or might our program be useful for the outcomes that the theory of change predicts, but maybe other related outcomes too? If we have a program on depression and it's effective for that, might it also be effective for something like post-traumatic stress disorder? And then we might also be interested in different populations with different characteristics. So we want to capture that through our external validity of our evaluation and our program. But I think the bigger challenge tends to be the internal validity piece. So there's a number of threats to internal validity that we have to consider as we design our outcome evaluation. And they fall into 2 groups. The first set at the top in the blue boxes are associated with threats, internal validity threats associated with the participants themselves. and who we bring in and how we decide to measure and test our participants. And then the bottom set of threats are those associated with our measurement and analysis. So which instruments we use, for example. It's important to be very familiar with these internal threats to validity. And I'm not going to spend valuable video time going through each one of these, although I do want you to look at them. And so how are we going to do that? Well, I want to take this opportunity at this point in the video to ask you to take a break. And maybe when you take that break, you can have a nice stretch. But I want you to go to the folders on the Google Drive, and there you'll see a document that has a definition of those internal threats to validity, to evaluations. And I want you to take a look at those and get a feel for those, because when you come back, we will apply those to some of our discussion about evaluation designs. Okay, so see you maybe in about 5 or 10 minutes. Okay, hope you had a chance to review the document about threats to internal validity. So I want to bring back our study designs and illustrate the different ways in which the design can create vulnerabilities to these threats to internal validity. You might notice off the bat that those designs that don't have a comparison group tend to have more vulnerability to threats to internal validity. So the before and after design, for example, the number of vulnerabilities include history, maturation, statistical regression to the mean, attrition, instrumentation, testing, and ambiguous temporal sequence. Similarly, case study design has a number of vulnerabilities in terms of threats to internal validity, as does the single time series design. Those with comparison groups are vulnerable to the issue of selection, as I mentioned, for quasi-experimental designs. Individuals in the treatment group are choosing to be there. They may be more motivated to make change than someone in a comparison group, again, depending on what kind of a comparison group you have. And so selection is definitely a vulnerability. That's why we have methods that you're going to learn about in another webinar or session, like propensity score matching. That helps to address or minimize the impact of selection bias. It doesn't always eliminate selection bias altogether. And as I mentioned, one of the stronger designs is that comparative time series design, where you have multiple observations before and multiple observations after the intervention. And you have a comparison group also with multiple observations that correspond to the time points where you have observations with the intervention group. Okay, so hopefully that gives you a flavor for why we have so many different designs. Get to know those designs, and also get to know which threats to validity are most important for your evaluation question and what matters to your stakeholders. So I want to give you an example where we used a before and after comparison group in Baltimore for the Baltimore City Healthy Start evaluation. Now in Baltimore, the Healthy Start program had geographically defined target areas in the city of Baltimore, and in those target areas, a large proportion of eligible clients received services and the intervention. over 70% of those who were eligible in the target areas were enrolled, thanks to intensive outreach efforts by the program. Now, women can be enrolled prenatally, and they can also be enrolled if they moved into the area after they delivered, if their infants were 6 months or younger. So you had prenatal enrollees and postpartum enrollees, and that made sense given that our primary outcome was infant mortality. And this situation of enrolling clients prenatally and postpartum created two groups: prenatal enrollees who got services during pregnancy, and then postpartum enrollees who, most of them did not live in the area when they were pregnant, so they didn't receive services, but they started receiving intensive services once they moved into the area and enrolled in Healthy Start. Now, when we were looking at pregnancy outcomes, because those were the secondary outcomes of our evaluation, that is low birth weight, preterm delivery, and small for gestational age. So when we were looking at those outcomes, that second group of women who were enrolled postpartum were a convenient comparison group for those pregnancy outcomes, because they were just as motivated as those prenatal enrollees to take part in an intensive program or a program with intensive services. So, treatment group for the pregnancy outcomes were those who enrolled prenatally. The comparison group were women who were equally motivated to be in Healthy Start and were in Healthy Start, but they never received any prenatal services. All right, how did that work out for us? Here are the data on the treatment group and comparison group, comparing their demographic characteristics. For the most part, they were similar enough: age, years of education, whether they had been employed, whether they were living below the poverty line. Some of the differences are starred there in yellow. That is, they had the comparison group had shorter inter-pregnancy intervals. Whoops. There we go. Sorry about that. The comparison group had shorter inter-pregnancy intervals and also initiated prenatal care later. All right, you already saw the punchline, which is when we compared adjusted odds ratios for the control versus treatment, or treatment versus control, we saw significant effects for low birth weight, very low birth weight, and preterm delivery, comparing prenatal enrollees to postpartum enrollees. And while we couldn't fully eliminate selection bias, we were able to minimize it because everyone in this particular analysis were willing to be part of a program as intensive as Healthy Start. So that's an example of how you might think about groups that might be good as a comparison group. Just so you know, we had a couple of different comparison groups for our Healthy Start treatment group. This one was the one that worked out the best, and I don't mean in terms of significant findings, but in terms of aligning those demographic characteristics that I showed you. They were the group that was the closest in terms of being aligned with the risk factors that the treatment group had. All right. So let's summarize then. As you design your outcome evaluation, you really need to consider your internal and external threats to validity and really be mindful of those as you select your evaluation design. Those are the things that are going to trip you up as you try and report your evaluation and have challenges from different reviewers about whether or not you did a good job. Also, don't forget about process evaluation findings. Use process evaluation findings to inform your outcome evaluation results. For example, in the Healthy Start analysis that we did, we knew that women in our treatment groups were receiving high levels of services. we did process evaluation to help us understand how the program was unfolding and being implemented. And if you can, more than one comparison group will strengthen your evaluation. That is, don't get the same kind of comparison group, but get a comparison group with a different set of vulnerabilities to threats to validity. All right, I think you're going to be on your way to thinking about outcome evaluation. Any questions that you have about outcome evaluation, please write them down, submit them to me, and I can be prepared to answer them on July 22nd. And if you have a program that you're working on for outcome evaluation or considering for the purpose of this course, what are your options for your outcome evaluation design? And what threats to validity are most important for you to address in your outcome evaluation? Finally, don't forget to read the article that we'll be discussing on the 22nd about outcome evaluation, and don't forget to fill out that reviewer form that helps you to evaluate the outcome evaluation on group prenatal care. All right, I'll see you on the 22nd, and we can talk more about outcome evaluation.